So now we've got our mass objects in position, this one here for the large section of the table, a smaller one here, and a third over here. So we can now go on to flesh out the shape of our table using collision objects. And remember, we need to select the mass object which we're going to use as parent before clicking on Create Box Collision Object. You may need to select the collision object in the node view, then use the Move tool to lift it out of the mass object in order to see it. We can then go on to Position and scale this collision object to be the first in a series which will make up the various different sections of this broken table. And you can see that these sections are irregularly shaped, so we are going to need to create quite a few of these collision objects in order to match the outline on the edges and the curved edges of the table surface. And it really doesn't matter if these individual collision objects overlap within a given section of the table, but it does matter if they overlap between the sections, because then you'll have collisions between these sections and the table will blow apart. So I'm going to continue to do that, and I'll pick it up again when I have the table fleshed out. So now you can see the completed table with all the collision objects in place. We can just step through those so you can see how this table is made up of a number of different collision objects, all of which overlap within a given section but not between sections. So now we can go back to the File menu into Character Edit mode and save this as a character which we're going to call Broken Table. Click OK. We're now going to create a chandelier which we're going to build in two sections. The body of the chandelier will be built the same way as the chair based on the standard prop character. The chain part, which is going to hang from the ceiling, is going to be loaded in as an FBX file. We can then join the two together using a constraint. So back to the File menu and Character Edit mode and create a new character. As with the chair, select the standard prop character and click OK. Now we want to import the mesh OBJ so that we can position some collision objects for the chandelier. Hit the I key, select All Chandelier Body from the Tutorial 6 Creating Props directory. Accept all the default values in the import dialog and click OK. And in the viewport you'll see that this chandelier graphic has been imported. Now the volume of this chandelier is quite spread out, and to best represent the mass of this thing we're going to want to change the mass object from a sphere to a cylinder. We can do that now by going to its property view and in the geometry type select cylinder. But we still have some work to do because the cylinder is in the wrong orientation. We want to swing it through 90 degrees so that it's representing the center column of the chandelier, and we also want to enlarge it. So select it now in the viewport, move up to its property view, and in the X orientation field type a value of -90 to swing through 90 degrees. And of course you'll see that the chandelier graphic goes with it because the chandelier graphic is a child of this mass object. So we now need to rotate the graphic back through 90 degrees to get it in the right position relatively. You can do that by selecting that graphic and using either the handle or again in its X orientation field in its property view you can type a value of 90. And now the relative orientations are correct. But the mass object is still quite small and in the wrong position relative to the graphic. So in fact we want to move the graphic down. So select the graphic in the viewport and use the Move tool to move it such that the mass object is about in its center to represent the center of mass. But now the mass object is still too small, and as I said before, the volume of the chandelier is quite spread out. So let's select the mass object and increase its size by typing some explicit values in its property view. So in the radius field, change the value of 0.2 to a value of 0.7, and in the length field, change the value to 1.5. And now you'll see that the mass object is much larger and more spread out. But in fact, because it's so large, with the default density value, it's going to be very, very heavy. We want to lighten it up a bit. So we can now go back to its property view, and in the density field, reduce the value to 0.3. So now that's set up, but the problem is we're going to carry on to build some collision objects to represent the volume of the chandelier, but that's going to be quite difficult with this large bulky mass object in the way. So let's just turn off the visualization of that mass object in the viewport. We can do that simply by clicking on its icon in the node view. And now we can go on to create collision objects to flesh out the rest of this chandelier. In this case we haven't deleted the default root collision object, so you could begin by using that and reshaping it, or you can delete that and build an entirely new set of collision objects. And that's what I'm going to go on to do now, and I'll pick it up again when that's complete. Now the chandelier is complete with collision objects representing all its arms, the main body and the candles. So we'll save that as a new character by going to character edit mode, save character as. We're going to save that as a character named Chandelier. Click OK. Now we want to join this chandelier to the chain that's going to hang it from the ceiling. Now if you've completed tutorial 4, creating environments, you can go on now to use the file you created in that. But if you haven't, let's go to the file menu, open a scene, navigate to tutorial 6 creating props, and select tutorial 6 creating props begin, and open that. And the first thing we want to do in here is delete all the events on the character 01 timeline. We're going to replace these later on to create a different animation. And now we're going to import another FPX to represent the chain for this chandelier. So either using the I key, the file menu, or the icon on the toolbar, open up the file browser to import Hall Chandelier Chain FPX. Select that and click open. And in the import dialog under the select root node for import section, make sure you have joint 1 selected. And then under the animation section, uncheck create animation event. We don't want to be creating any animation events when we import this FPX. We also want to uncheck create simulation events because again we don't want to be creating any simulation events as we import this FPX. And now click OK. And you can see there in the viewport the chandelier chain FPX has been imported, and then down here on the timeline the Hall Chandelier Chain FPX has its own character track. And so select that now in the timeline and use the move tool to move the chandelier up till it's just about touching the ceiling. Just about there should be fine. Now go and right click on the chandelier chain's timeline and create a constraint event. Make sure this begins at frame 0 and ends at around frame 500. Make sure that the top end of the chain is selected and the constraint is of type lock, which will just lock this top end in space. Now we want to bring in the chandelier to attach it to the bottom of the chain, so go to add new character and select the chandelier you created in the previous section of this tutorial and click OK. If you skipped the previous section of the tutorial and didn't create your own chandelier, there's a pre-prepared one in the tutorial 6 creating props directory. Now let's select that chandelier in the timeline, again use the move tool to move it up until it's just about hanging from the bottom of the chain, so each 4 ends of the chain are touching at the arms of the chandelier. And now we'll create another constraint event, this time in the chandelier's timeline. Make that start at frame 0 and stretch it out to frame 500. And now we want to ensure that we're in selection mode and select all 4 ends of this chain so that we can join them to the chandelier. You can do that by control left clicking and then right click to complete that selection. Now let's ensure that the constraint is of type join bodies, and this will join all those selected sections together. Now let's simulate, and you'll see that the chandelier drops a little before settling into position. Now let's just do a very quick test by applying a force to the chandelier and watching it swing. So into the chandelier's character's timeline, let's right click and create a force event. In its property view, we'll set the strength value to 3 just to reduce the strength down and give it a little push, and then we'll simulate, and you can see that the chandelier swings to and fro as it's pushed. So everything seems to be working. Let's just play that animation back. You can see that the chain actually is jumping around a little, isn't very firm. We can fix that by using an active pose. So let's remove the existing animation, and on the Hall chain timeline we'll right click and create an active pose event. Let's move that down to another track, start at frame 0 and stretch it out to end with the constraints at frame 500. Now let's simulate again, and this time you'll see that the chain is a lot firmer, a lot stiffer, and that extra strength is being given to it by the active pose which holds it in place. And we can change the strength of that active pose to give us different results in its property view under the strength value here, and I encourage you to experiment with that. But our test done, we can now delete the force event, and I'll do that by right clicking on that force event and selecting delete selected events, because we're not going to need that for our further animation.